How can we understand Marx's political thought from the point of view of the constituent power, but also how the theory and the understanding of constituent power can be rethought from a Marxist point of view. And the first element, the first aspect, the one that Artem already mentioned, is that the place Marx's relation to the constituent power remains a question and a problem. It is a question because he never uses the term explicitly, although its meaning it's very present in most of his political writings. It is also a problem because it seems, and that will be one of my claims, that Marx entertained two different understandings of constituent power that point to two different political paradigms, two different models of political power. So there are, in other words, two distinct interpretations in Marx's writings that indicate two contrasting versions of the power to constitute, and this complicates the study of the constituent power in Marx's thought. The first, the most prominent and familiar version, appears in the young Marx 1843 confrontation with Hegel's political philosophy, and in some other writings during a two-year period, let's say for 1843 to 1845, and it was part of his early material humanism and heavily influenced by Ludwig Feuerbach's critical method. It follows and renews a longer tradition of constituent politics, which he sought to radicalize, but ultimately he abandoned. In this early version, the constituent power is presented as a democratic movement against political alienation, constitutional objectification, and the mystification of the state. And it evokes a revolutionary vision of human emancipation and radical autonomy in the form of perpetual collective self-determination and the popular activity of foundings and refoundings. In other words, in the first early version, constituent power stands for the active, conscious, ongoing self-constitution of society, what Marx famously called true democracy. This is the, let's say, I will call it the democratic version of the constituent power, although it has also faces some objective problems. It is part of an essentialistic understanding of the human. It's part of a humanistic and naturalistic period in Marx's writings. So there is this terminology that he owns to Feuerbach of species being, of the human externalizing one's essence and authentic existence. But nevertheless, it belongs to the longer tradition of the constituent power that emerges around the 16th century in early modernity. The second version is introduced in his writings on the 1848 European revolutions and enacts a decisive break with the first formulation. Although it has been overlooked and relatively unexplored by Marxist scholars, it inaugurates a radical conceptual resignification of the modern history of the constituent power. It marks a departure from the paradigm of democratic autonomy towards the Republican model of dictatorship, elaborated in terms of civil war and the revolutionary state of emergency. In other words, constituent power, in this second formulation, describes a revolutionary class struggle against the counter-revolution, and Marx coined a new term in 1850, the dictatorship of the working class, that is better known from the 1852 reformulation as the dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, in the second version, the constituent power is collapsed into the category of dictatorship, something that I think Carl Schmitt was the first to notice. So the first and second, the first version is, as I mentioned earlier, corresponds to Marx's early humanist period. It is also a bit quite quasi-romantic. It has a romantic, moralizing, and at the same time highly normative dimension. It is directed against political alienation, and it links, associates democracy with the vision of a non-alienated society, a society beyond alienation. The second version is much more strategic and pragmatic, one might say cynically realistic, and it is a reaction to the defeats of the European revolutions of 1848 and the different victories of the counter-revolution that propelled Marx to develop a theory of constituent power qua dictatorship, what I will name a theory of constituent dictatorship that remained constant throughout the later years and his later understanding of politics. In other words, in the second version, he reactivated the Republican logic of dictatorial power in the context of a revolutionary situation by transposing the state of emergency into the Constituent Act and turning the emancipatory art of insurrection into a military technique of class war. This represents the second phase of Marx's understanding of the constituent power. So very briefly about the first one. So the first version that one can find it theorized in the works of Miguel Abensur, but ultimately the best version, the best and first appropriation is in the writings of Cornelius Castoriadis in Socialism and Barbarie, especially around the late 50s, early 60s, where the problem of alienation becomes a problem of heteronomy, and the overcoming of alienation signifies the realization of autonomy and an autonomous society. In this very early formulation, there is a strong influence of Feuerbach's transformative method, and it is a radicalization of the critique, the famous critique of religion, to the critique of the state and the critique of politics. So the basic claim here, interpretative claim, is the following, that Marx, moving beyond his earlier polemics against political theology by expanding considerably the critical scope of Feuerbach's method in an attempt to develop an original critique of political alienation, he argued, or he made the claim, the methodological claim, to return from the object to the subject, from the effect to the cause, from the state to the people. So it's the famous act of reversal between predicate and subject. So the method, the Marxian method of reversal was formalized, explained by Marx himself in the following, I quote, "The correct approach will be to start with the real subject and then consider its objectification," end of quote. So that Marx, in a radical attempt to grasp by the root the problem of political estrangement and resolve once and for all the riddle of every constitution against this mystifying abstraction, he stumbled upon the constituent power of the whole demos. The term whole demos appears in Marx's writings. The democratic that is articulated as the real democratic foundation, the ultimate final ground of the political. And this is the famous argument by Marx that it's following Hobbes and Spinoza, that democracy is a generic constitution, that is the constitution that one can find at the foundations of every political form. And this idea of a generic constitution is directly linked with his understanding of the constituent power. In other words, a democratic constituent power is always present in the foundation of any political order. It is within this attempt to solve the riddle of constitutionalism and to solve it democratically that the constituent power initially appears in Marx's writings, even if the name is absent. Any discussion of his early theory of the constituent power, therefore, must begin with his post-Hegelian understanding of objectification and the problem of alienation it gives rise. It's very difficult to grasp his early understanding of the constituent power outside his theory of objectification and outside the negative possibility of alienation. Marx was not against objectification in general, was against an objectification that turns into an alienation. And the solution from preventing this to happen is the constituent power. In other words, the constituent power is Marx's solution to the problem of an alienation gone wrong, of an alienation turned into an objectification. So I will not go into all these details about the huge literature around Marx's concept of objectification that was very prominent in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, the big debates with Althusser on the relation of his essentialistic humanism. But it's important to note that some descriptions in Marx's early work, when he describes the state, and I quote, objectified man, or the state is a human social object. That becomes obvious also in his 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, where he develops a general theory of objectification as a necessary and inescapable dimension of social life. The basic idea is that we create objects that project our authentic essence, but as it happens, these objects acquire an independent existence, become alien. This is the famous term by Marx. So they become understood or experienced as superior, independent, ruling over their producers, the creators. And in politics, this means that the state acquires an independent, sovereign existence that is above, beyond, and superior of the demos of the people that have created it. And this is when objectification turns into an alienating experience. Here it's important to note one of the formulations by the young Marx, loss of object, he calls it. So to be alienated is to lose. It's to lose one's object. And the idea also, it's in a much more poetic version. In the same text, he also describes alienation as losing one's desire, when one's desire becomes the inaccessible object of another. And this is very important to understand the real democratic dimension of his early theory of the constituent power. So alienation for the young Marx, that's a little bit different or very different from his later concept of exploitation, describe this inverted reality, this inverted relation of society to its institutions. So the problem of the constituent power is how to establish the proper relationship between society and its institutions, where the institutions of society will be objectifications, but always under the control, the knowledge, and the supervision of that society. In other words, it's when a society, as Castoriadis wrote, constitutes itself in a conscious and lucid manner. So by inverting the relationship between the state and the people, the constituted and the constituting, Marx identified the concrete, actual demos as the real sovereign, and I quote, who have the right to make a new constitution, end of quote, and opposed it to the fictitious, spectral, and thus erroneous doctrine of monarchical sovereignty and the corresponding idea of the modern state as a sovereign subject standing outside society and above its divisions and conflicts. The true ground of the constitutional state and of any state in general for Marx, that is, of any constituted order, is the people and their power to establish the political and legal forms of their living together by creating the institutional framework of their free and equal coexistence. So the constitutional state or the constitutional order is an effect of the collective activity of its subjects. by asserting that, and I quote, the Constitution is thus posited as the people's own creation. The Constitution is in appearance what it is in reality, the free creation of men, end of quote. Marx, contra Hegel, affirmed the core principle of the constituent power and its sovereign primacy over the constituted society, that is, the popular power to form, frame, alter, and abolish their government. He treated this positing and instituting power as a fundamental attribute of popular sovereignty, which he described in terms of the revolutionary act to make and unmake constitutional orders, that is, he fully endorsed the idea of the constituent sovereign people. Marx, therefore, defined sovereignty in terms of the constituent power, that is, of the power to found, to posit, to constitute. And since this power resides in the entire demos and is immanent to the people, sovereignty can exist only as popular. In short, the popular sovereign for Marx is a constituent subject, that is, a people or a demos who exercise their full power to constitute. And here the similarities, let's say, with the work of Sayes, but also of Thomas Paine, are very profound. One might say that to a certain degree, the political thought of the young Marx remains within a broadly defined bourgeois democratic framework. This becomes obvious with the subordination of the category of the class to the category of the people or the demos. Class analysis is relatively absent from these early writings from 1843 to 1845. The second dimension is that sovereignty and constituent power are linked together, but the revolutionary dimension plays a secondary role. The third element is that the dominant political category here is still the idea or the concept of democracy, or what he calls true democracy. So there are more things to say about what he owns to the early tradition of the constituent power, but this is something that can wait. Now, no less than I'm moving to the second version that became the dominant one, as it was the result of abandoning the first formulation. In no less than 5 years, Marx's views on the constituent power changed radically, as he seems to have abandoned the first formulation. This shift and reorientation occurs in 1848 and lasts over a period of 4 to 5 years, and there are approximately 220 articles he wrote for newspapers, commenting, explaining, interpreting the European revolutions of the mid of the 19th century. His thorough and incisive study of this continental revolutionary wave led him to profoundly rethink revolutionary politics as such, and to radically reconsider and revise his previous views about the constituent power. This is a moment of a radical shift when it comes to the position of the constituent power in Marx's thinking. And it's a shift that has gone relatively unnoticed to the scholars, let's say, the Marxist-oriented scholars of the constituent power. They like to emphasize the first element, the democratic aspect, and those who discuss the second element, the problem of dictatorship in Marx, they don't do it in relationship to the constituent power. So these two different interpretative trends have not gone, they never really encounter each other, only in the case of Carl Schmitt in his theory of sovereign dictatorship. Now, in 1848, Marx abandoned the earlier references to the general theory of the people, severed the links with what he called himself the cult of the people, that he described as a bourgeois abstraction and a ruling ideological distortion, to emphasize instead the class composition of the constituent subject and its proletarian identity. So, The first element from this shift is that class people disappear and it is replaced by class. And now the constituent power is not defined by the subjectivity of the people or the popular, but is defined by the subjectivity of the proletarian or of labor. Accordingly, Marx situated the politics of the constituent power on the terrain of political antagonism in its most intense form, class civil war. This new orientation, in other words, the question of revolution in Marx, it's transformed into a question of civil war from 1848 and later. This new orientation indicates a radical conceptual resignification, a break from the modern tradition of the constituent power, and corresponds to the introduction of another concept, another paradigm of power predicated on the exception and based on an emergency, the Roman concept of dictatorship, which he famously reformulated as the class dictatorship of the proletariat. This was one of the earliest formulations, where the element of class becomes predominant, and the experience of revolution is subordinated to the framework of a civil war. Here it's important to note that although historically one might say that revolutions and civil wars, they have gone together, it is important to notice that for Marx, there is no revolution without a civil war. In other words, a revolution is always a kind of war. And since it is a kind of war, it's also a kind of emergency. And if it's a kind of emergency, it requires a proper response. So that he took it, of course, from the Jacobin and post-Jacobin tradition of the public safety. This introduction of the logic, the language, and the concept of public safety into the revolutionary experience led Marx to a theory of dictatorship as constituent power. Marx's bold reorientation in terms of class dictatorship occurs in his writings on the 1848 Frankfurt National Assembly and the French Constituent Assembly in Paris. So he spends a lot of, in these 220 articles, he emphasizes critically, he analyzes critically the politics of these two constituent assemblies. And out of their failures, he draws and he develops his theory of the constituent power as a class dictatorship of the proletariat. It is about their failures to establish a Red Republic and the victory of the counter-revolution that led Marx to rethink his original positions about the constituent power. The turn to dictatorship and its logic is motivated mostly by a pragmatic and strategic consideration and the desire, in a Machiavellian sense, to choose the best means for the realization of one end. In other words, how we are going to win the revolutionary war, we are not really going to win it democratically, we are going to win it dictatorially. That's the basic idea. In his writings on the two assemblies in Frankfurt and Paris, Marx recognized outright, and I quote, their constituent nature. So he recognized that these two revolutionary assemblies were constituent assemblies. He treated them as sovereign bodies dedicated, and I quote, to the work of constitution making. Until here, the whole approach is conventional, firmly situated in the tradition of the constituent power. He also argued that they had constituent omnipotence, which means that they can use both executive and legislative power, and at the same time, they should form also a revolutionary government. In other words, these assemblies for Marx should have all powers united, executive, legislative, constituent power together, so to become omnipotent assemblies. But they didn't do so, and therefore they were defeated. So Marx draws the claim that the mixing of executive and legislative power in the Constituent Assembly, the increase of its powers in the form of a provisional revolutionary government should be predicated, and I quote, on revolutionary terrorism. So here is also the moment that Marx explicitly, for the first time, introduced the question of violence and terror during a revolution. It's not only that the problem, it's not anymore objectification or alienation. The problem now it's class oppression. And a revolution, a communist revolution, will have to undo this class oppression. For this reason, he argued that the problem of these two revolutions, in the German, in the Prussian and the French case, is, and I quote, the salut public, public safety, he mentions, which is of decisive significance in any unconstitutional situation. So suddenly the problem of public safety becomes the most decisive matter in an unconstitutional situation. Therefore, he insisted, and I claim, every state which finds itself in a provisional situation requires a dictator and an energetic dictator at that. End of quote. Actually, he argued, the failure of the two assemblies was due, and I quote, to their failure to act dictatorially. End of quote. Had they acted dictatorially, that is decisively, Marx argues, they would have prevailed over the counter-revolution. Had they taken all necessary measures, according to him, that is, including revolutionary terror, in the name of the safety of the people, they would have been in a position to defeat their class enemies. So just to conclude, Plekhanov, in the end of the 19th century, described the Marx theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat according to the reformulation of the French revolutionary principle. So Plekhanov said that dictatorship is salus revolutionis suprema lex. So that the safety of the revolution is the ultimate final law, where everything is permitted. This is precisely the principle that Lenin adopted in 1917 explicitly to justify the Soviet revolution, and goes all the way back to Marx's second theory of the constituent power, that is a form of collective dictatorship that can now constitute the foundations of a new socialist society. In other words, dictatorship and constituent power become identified, become synonymous in Marx's later writings. Now, the implications of this shift from the theory of true democracy to the theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat have been profound for the history of the socialist and communist movements, but also profound at the level of revolutionary thinking. But I'm not going to say anything more because I have abused my time. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I have just kind of small provocative question. Is that shift from dictatorship, from the early revolutionary period, and also his work with Engels for Neue Rheinische Zeitung, where they explicitly said that they built democratic hegemony, and they never spoke in, they didn't really spoke in terms of dictatorship, or maybe I missed something. And so this shift from early Republican Marx to the Marx of dictatorship, is it really a shift within the, from one constituent power to another, or from constituent power to some form of constituted power? Because within the revolutions, if we look at the French one, or Paris Commune, or Russian revolutions, what preceded dictatorship moments were actually this kind of hegemonic coalitions and constellations. And so one can probably say that dictatorship was the first moment of constituted power of some sort.
Thank you. Yes, very interesting questions. Very quickly, I will not say, I will disagree with the first formulation. From early Republican Marx to dictatorship. Actually, this neo-Republican interpretation of Marx that have become very, how to put them, popular, influential in some leftist academic circles are completely misguided. These are, I would say, bourgeois attempts to de-revolutionize Marx. The movement actually, because to argue that Marx is a theory of non-domination is to turn Marx into a liberal thinker of a negative freedom. That's not the case. Actually, his conception of freedom was a positive one, appropriate against alienation, controlling, mastering one's labor and one's products. But I will say that there is a shift from an early democratic Marx to a later Republican Marx. Because true democracy and his early writings are more about the demos. He uses even the Greek term demos. He does also the term plebs appears in Marx when he discusses revolutionary terror, and he describes revolutionary terror as the plebeian method of defeating one's enemies. Of course, in Rome, they never defeated the plebeians, the patricians, so we don't know really what that method would have been, but in any case. About the second question, yes, that's an important one, because dictatorship in its traditional conventional form was a constituted power through the... In the Roman case, it was really a constitutional office of one particular kind. Marx, in that case, he breaks away from this long tradition. He's not the first. That was first initiated, although not very theoretically, not in a very sophisticated form, by Marat, when he introduced the idea of revolutionary dictatorship in Les Amis du Peuple, but it becomes much more developed for the first time with Babeuf and his Conspiracy of the Equals, where there is a theory of revolutionary dictatorship that used to be called, this is how it is mentioned by Buonarroti, la révolution des insurrections. So the revolution of insurrections is a form of dictatorship, according to Babeuf. So there we have a more dialectical relationship between the constituent and the constituted, although dictatorship now has... the question is what remains dictatorial in Marx's second theory of the constituent power. What remains is the emergency. And this is the crucial point, that Marx understands now a revolution not as an art of insurrection, and this is his own term, the revolution is an insurrectional art, but now he understands the revolution as an emergency, that is, as a military confrontation. This is the crucial aspect that leads to the blending of constituent power and dictatorship. When the revolution signifies a moment of civil war, therefore a moment of the war of all against all. And then you need a dictatorship to make use of all necessary means of violence, terror, and force.
I wanted to mention Bolshevism and Moral Problem by Lukács, which he writes in 1918, and then implies that a democratic transformative application to radical social transformation is impossible, but studying epistemologies, comparative epistemologies of socialism and capitalism, and dealing with the politeconomic Marx, one can say that his theory of use value is already quite dictatorial. So, I mean, it's a long issue and a long debate, but insistence of Marx when he claims that already exchange announce use value, and use value is the only humanistic way to deal economically in the society, is quite dictatorial.
Yes, there are many differences. Of course, there is the difference of the subject, but I would say in a more abstract way, it's the difference of the who and the how, because the second version represents a different paradigm of power. Dictatorship was predicated, is an institution, the Roman emergency institution, but as a concept in general, is predicated on the idea of force and coercion. That's the logic of dictatorship, is a kind of coercion unregulated by law. To a certain degree, or relaxed from the law. Now, the constituent power has nothing to do with oppression and the coercion. The logic of the constituent power is a creative, productive, positing aspect. And for this reason, most classical theories of the constituent power don't engage with questions of violence, because violence is not understood as a defining element of this kind of power to constitute. So I will locate the important differences in the modality or the phenomenology of two different conceptions of power, one that is creative, the other that is coercive. The one usually requires centralized power, and let's not forget that in most of his writings, Marx wanted centralization. He was a centralizer. He was against decentralization, against federalism, while the constituent power leans towards the idea of federalism, the dispersion of power, the participation from below. And this points to what I mentioned before, that the underlying reason for this shift is that now for him a revolution means a war. And once a revolution means a war, what matters in a war is brutal force, nothing else. And the strategic considerations of how to defeat your enemy. It's not anymore an emancipatory act of collective freedom. It's just repressing your enemy and moving on after you have defeated.
Yeah, thanks, Andreas. So I get the argument, but at the same time, I think the juxtaposition is a bit too strong, because Marx thinks of the dictatorship of the proletariat himself as a genuinely democratic institution, one that he confronts with the class dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which is the dictatorship behind formal democracy of one small part of society over the large mass of society, whereas the dictatorship of the proletariat is conceptualized as the rule of the large mass of society over the smaller number of the enemies of that transition. And it's not so much, in my understanding, and Bolivar has argued for that at length in his study on the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat, therefore a dictatorship in the institutional sense, or as defined by coercion, but rather, in some ways, a genuinely democratic articulation of constituent power in that transitional period. That doesn't mean that there are no tensions, doesn't mean that he doesn't run into the problems that you describe, and that there is a kind of shift to the more strategic, realist paradigm, but I think there is no clear break with the previous, generally radical democratic understanding of constituent power, just the rearticulation in this different register.
Maybe another question? Kirill?
Yes, thank you. Going in the same direction, what do you make of Marx's interpretation of the Paris Commune? Because obviously it fails as a winning in the civil war in France, even though Lenin used it as a model of a future triumphant dictatorship of the proletariat. But it seems that Marx writes about this experience also because this proletariat amounts to a kind of a democratic subject more than triumphant dictator.
Have any response?
Yes, excellent points. Now, I was always very suspicious to Althusser's claim about an epistemological break for many decades, until I started working on this topic, and it seems to me that here there is a huge break in Marx thought. I will not say that represents a break in his whole oeuvre, as claimed by Althusser, but certainly there is a different emphasis in his writings. It's not anymore this kind of romantic essentialism of the species being, of humanity, of naturalism. Everything becomes extremely instrumental. And one senses in these articles he wrote from 1842 to 1852 a kind of a deep disappointment with his early theory that was impotent in front of military violence, in front of the state of siege, martial laws that were deployed by the counter-revolutionary force. So I will say we can, definitely, one can have also dialectical reading and put them together. But it seems to me that it will be overimposed onto Marx's thinking. The earlier version about true democracy really disappears. Now, it is sublimated as communism. But communism is not a political form, really. There is no political power. So I would say that there is I'm more prone, inclined to see a deep break, rupture, when it comes to the constituent power in Marx. And this is about the Paris Commune. In the Paris Commune, the problem is not Marx, the problem is Engels. Hegel said in the introduction after Marx's death that Marx meant the dictatorship of the proletariat to be the Paris Commune. Marx does not use the term dictatorship of the proletariat in his writings on the Paris Commune. He doesn't say anything about that. What he says, though, through different letters and other writings in his critique of the Paris Commune is that they didn't use force enough, that they didn't centralize force, so that they were military weak. So when you bring that criticism of the Paris Commune with his writings of 1848, why these two constituent assemblies failed because they didn't act dictatorially, then you might also reach the same conclusions, that his dissatisfaction or his critique with the Paris Commune is that it was not really dictatorial. Actually, the Paris Commune became a dictatorship, something that very few pay attention to, unfortunately, because 2 weeks before their military defeat, there was a huge debate within the Paris Commune about establishing a committee of public safety. And the Paris Commune became divided between Blanquists and Proudhonists, because Marxists were a minority in the Paris Commune. And the Blanquists won, and they established a committee of public safety, that is a form of dictatorship, but it didn't save the Commune. After two weeks, they were fully defeated. Marx never comments on that. And actually, the debates in the meetings about whether to have or not a committee of public safety are very interesting, because the Blanquists use exactly Marx's arguments, that now this is not a revolution anymore, it's a war. And we need to concentrate power, to have military discipline in order to defeat the bourgeoisie. The Proudhonists argue from a democratic point of view, that a committee of public safety is an anti-democratic emergency institution. So, I would say that there Marx is a bit suspiciously silent about that.
Okay.